Starting. Great. So hello again. We'll start with B, who is presenting today on the gendered bathroom, as we've just heard. And B, would you like? Sorry, B, I don't have your bio up. Would you like to introduce what you like? Well, that you're from Winchester, and what your area is, and then crack on. Yeah, the drive isn't where it's supposed to be. So yeah, thank you very much, B. I really look forward to your presentation.
Got it, thank you. Hi everyone, yes, so my name is B. I use they, them pronouns. I am a third year education studies with inclusion student. So I'm not a postgrad student yet, but next year I will be studying gender, sexuality and culture MA at Birkbeck University. So the stuff I'm talking about today is stuff that I've based an essay or two on. I've also done a bit of writing that's been published on a website called Cactus Equality. If you want to check that out, I've written a little bit on queer experiences, but also sexual harassment as well. And I'm also getting a bit of work published in the King Alfred Journal in May, all about Section 28 and the lasting effect that has had on queer youth in the education system. So if you're interested in any of those bits and pieces, feel free to give it a look. I did this research for a module I did last year on sexuality and education. So as you can see, there will be lots of links to kind of education, educational policy throughout this. Feel free to pop questions in the chat. I've got the chat open, so pop questions and comments in as we go, but I'll kind of get through my bit and then afterwards we can kind of do the questions at the end. And in terms of vocabulary that I'll be using, there'll be a lot of mention of stuff like cisgender, transgender, but I also use the term gender creative to describe individuals who are trans or non-binary or genderqueer, or who just don't align with their sex at birth. So if there's any terms that I use that people are like, oh, I'm not 100% on them, feel free to pop it in the chat and I can give like a quick definition or description of how I'm using that term in this situation. So yeah, so as you guys know, today I'm doing a talk on the allegory of the gendered bathroom. So I'm using kind of gendered bathrooms as a scaffold for this argument that gendered bathrooms are a fantastic way of introducing the conversation of gender inclusion in education. However, it can serve to distract people and focus them more on the physical boundaries when there actually needs to be a shift to more of the attitudinal boundaries that are going on in society. So why is change needed when we're referring to gender creative students in educational settings? And as you can see from Goldberg's research here, as many as 75% of trans students report feeling unsafe in high school because of their gender expression, and 50% of trans students report being prevented from using the name or pronoun that match this gender. And as you'll see going throughout, you'll hear kind of high school and secondary. There is some American and some UK research that I've kind of looked at here, but it all kind of refers to the similar age of either kind of high school or secondary school age. So we can kind of assume from the age of about 12, 13 up until about 18, but also into higher educational institutions such as university places. So this kind of demonstrates that there are structural boundaries that do influence the lived experience of gender creative students. And a lot of the time they do kind of flow from this attitudinal stigma. And then they are kind of presented in these physical ways, such as individuals writing reports on students and using their wrong names or pronouns, or students being forced to use the wrong bathroom that does not typically align with their gender. This also demonstrates the assumption of heteronormativity and cis-normativity as well, that are evident in multiple areas of education. You can see it in the curriculum, you can see it in classroom practices. A really key example of it at the minute is the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, which anyone who knows about the Section 28 bill that was input in educational policy in the UK about 30, 40 years ago now, it has massive echoes of that. And anyone who doesn't know anything about the Don't Say Gay bill or Section 28, it is basically stopping individuals from talking about and having these conversations around sexuality, with also gender roles being introduced there. But I'd really recommend signing a few petitions, because this is something that is really harmful to the LGBTQ plus community in America. And we've seen it happen in the UK before, and there are still some shadows kind of overlapping the educational system. That's not why I'm here today. We're talking about gender today. So it displays this assumption of heteronormativity and cis-normativity. So from the curriculum to classroom practices, which does display how deeply ingrained these ideas are. It shows that, yes, these are structural, these are physical and tangible boundaries, but it shows how deeply ingrained they are in the institution of education, and how we really need to uproot those really harmful attitudes and boundaries to make education a more inclusive space for everyone, not just individuals who are more gender creative. We have seen some success in particular schools. They've integrated more transgender inclusive policies in educational spaces, which does provide masses of support for the inclusion of other policies. It's kind of a bit of a snowball effect. Once one or two start to come through, once the vocabulary starts to develop, more and more start to come about, and schools become this really inclusive hub for individuals to fully explore themselves and understand themselves better in the scope of gender as well. So policy is a really important aspect that does need changing. If I keep looking down as well, I have some notes written down here, so I'm not just like looking down on my phone, I am checking notes. So policy is a really important intervention. However, policy isn't the only change that is needed to help kind of facilitate this more inclusive attitude around gender in the classroom. As you can see on the screen, so policy itself is a necessary political intervention, but it is rendered ineffective unless educators can address their own subconscious desires for learning and teaching within a gender binary and cisgenderist framework. So kind of put simply, the educators, the people making the policies, the people teaching the curriculum need to kind of reassess their individual stigmas, unconscious or conscious, and really to have that kind of critical thought and kind of critical discussion with themselves and with other educators and policymakers to kind of uproot those ideas that are stuck in the gender binary and stuck in that cisgenderist framework that education has been stuck in now for, I would argue, 70, 80, 100 years with kind of the modern education system. Therefore, policies must be nuanced. They can't just be a couple of inclusive bits of language kind of stuck on a piece of paper. They need to be nuanced and engage in those conversations past policy, and they need to facilitate those conversations. We can't just include policy just for the sake of being inclusive. We can't do it as a tokenistic gesture to certain minorities or groups. It has to be something that allows for further engagement with kind of those topics and with those ideas. They also need to be used to create the space for transgender and gender creative voices as well. By writing policies as a tick box exercise, they don't really work to affirm gender creative identities, and they don't reflect the value that individuals bring to educational environments. A lot of the time, by focusing on this kind of tick box exercise, it does reduce gender creative individuals to problems that need to be solved. This is not the case. They are not issues that need to be solved. It is something that the school needs to work on themselves in order to make their institution more inclusive and to more open spaces for those individuals as well. We've seen a lot of the time in policy that it is reactionary, not a proactive mechanism. This basically means that policy has come about because of certain actions that have happened. So policy has come about to stop those actions from happening again, whether that is hate crime or individuals being targeted. And it's been aimed at individuals to stop specific behaviours. It's not been targeted at structural or cultural inequalities that need addressing. It is just there to stop certain individuals from being non-inclusive. It has not been used to kind of help individuals feel more safe and included and involved in the spaces they are already in. By working in reactionary ways, policies ignore the systemic roots of discrimination, which prevents open conversations about the effects of cultural unconsciousness on gender creative individuals. And this kind of ignorance that it promotes does kind of shut down those conversations, and individuals don't feel as though those discussions are facilitated in spaces where they should feel safe and they should feel like they have value and they deserve those spaces at those institutions, whether they are secondary or higher educational learning environments. So as you can see on the screen, it is crucial that the conversation regarding the importance of transgender accommodation within schools is not seen as fulfilled simply because policy has created a space for discussing trans affirmative engagement. So conversation surrounding transgender support and inclusion in schools can't just simply be completed because policy has created that space. Policy then creates kind of that bubble. We need to use policy to kind of make sure that that bubble encapsulates the entire school. A lot of the time, policies that are used ignore kind of the intersectionality of students' lived experiences. So, for example, Black transgender students, a lot of the time, their voices are completely silenced. In some educational institutions, they are heard as a Black student or as a gender creative student. Those voices are not seen in tangent. And we need to really make sure that we need to highlight and celebrate those intersections that make people human, kind of the melting pot that makes us all who we are. Because people are multifaceted. No one can be defined by one single label. And if we reduce people to one single label in policy, it thus then kind of ignores that lived experience and doesn't allow those conversations to occur in educational institutions. Anti-discrimination policies in particular, so ones that typically look at sexuality, gender, race, religion, among others, they do try to put individuals in clearly defined boxes and say, right, so transgender students, and try to kind of group them all together. This does help slightly when you're looking at policy, because it does mean that there are tangible groups of people that you can kind of help support. However, it then means that some individuals who are on the boundaries of different groups or who fit into multiple groups then don't quite know where they stand. And it does kind of ignores kind of the Venn diagram that makes all of us up, of all these kind of overlapping aspects of our ideas and of what makes us as human beings. So kind of linking this all to the allegory of the gendered bathroom. So allegory is like a story or a narrative used to describe a situation. So I'm using gendered bathrooms as kind of a bit of a narrative to demonstrate some of these inequalities. So it's been used in modern literature as a symbolic allegory to facilitate conversations about transgender rights centered around the physical barriers they face in public spaces, which includes educational institutions. So we've seen it for the last kind of 3-4 years in literature. Gendered bathrooms have come about as kind of this physical, tangible representation of some of the inequalities that gender creative students face. Which is a fantastic way to kind of think of these issues in a physical way. As human beings, trying to think of kind of abstract ideas of discrimination on institutional, cultural, and attitudinal levels, that is a really difficult thing to do, especially when you're looking at the intersectionality of different groups. So by focusing on kind of this physical barrier, individuals who haven't ever come across this kind of discrimination, if they haven't, if it hasn't happened to them individually, but also if they haven't physically seen it happen to individuals they know, this does help them kind of create that mental space and really think about those conversations that they can be having and what they can be doing to support. However, by focusing on physical barriers, it does evoke images of violence and discrimination, which does represent some of the lived experiences that gender creative students have faced and do still face in their educational institutions when they really are not safe. However, this can, for some cisgender individuals who have not experienced this or do not know that this is going on, this can immediately shut them down to having this conversation, because they will immediately kind of visualize all of these horrible things happening, and this just completely shuts them out of the conversation. So we need to make sure that we look at physical barriers, but we understand that they are just the tip of the iceberg in these conversations, and we make sure that this helps to facilitate other conversations that will then help to support trans, non-binary, genderqueer, gender creative students overall. Furthermore, so gender bathrooms, they do work on cis-normative assumptions that everyone feels comfortable using the toilets for the sex they're assigned at birth. It assumes that there are two genders, male and female, and that everyone feels comfortable using those toilets. As a result of this in schools, so gender creative students either have to go out of their way to try to source gender neutral bathrooms or use disabled bathrooms. That is typically an experience that I know a lot of my gender creative friends face. When there isn't the inclusive bathrooms there, they will just go use the disabled toilet, because that one is that does not focus on a gender, that is just looking at an individual's ability. It does mean that students need to explicitly ask for gender neutral bathroom options, or they need to make that active decision. They need to stand in front of those doors and think, which one best describes me when I do not align with either of these that are here. It also reinforces the assumption that change can occur when gender creative students are attending that specific institution. It places a responsibility on those students' shoulders and says, this is what you need, so you need to go about and ask for this. And in doing so, this can actually out a lot of gender creative students, because if they ask for a different bathroom, this then means that some individuals will have to come out and explain their gender identity as a reasoning behind it, which for a lot of people, if they don't feel safe doing that, they will then go about either using bathrooms that make them feel uncomfortable, or it's a big mental health factor that can cause a lot of mental health issues in especially very young gender creative students in certain institutions, if they don't feel supported by peers or by teachers or just by any member of the school community. So kind of looking forward from this, there needs to be a shift in attitudes beyond policy. So changes that are made regarding policy and physical barriers, they are helping to facilitate positive attitudes. However, more can be done to kind of resolve these issues of discrimination against gender creative students. And I've kind of helpfully put it into kind of these three boxes that I've kind of done a bit of research into and hope to kind of do some further research into when I do my master's next year. So educational professions typically view transgender students as issues that need resolutions, which we know is not the case. It overlooks the students' value that they bring to school, and it kind of just reduces them to an issue. They are not seen as a human being, they are seen as their gendered label. This also ignores the intersectionality of individuals' lived experiences and dismisses the impact the environment has on the individual's attitudes, therefore placing all the responsibility on the shoulders of those gender creative students, which is a massive burden for those students when they are going through GCSEs, A-levels, choosing their options when they're studying at university. There's enough stuff going on without them having to think about an issue such as which bathroom they should be using or they want to use and feel comfortable using. So we need to shift past this and look at the application of more anti-oppressive pedagogy. So pedagogy is looking at the theory of teaching and learning. So we need to look at the application of anti-oppressive teaching and learning strategies in classrooms. There needs to be a shift in this. So by applying policy, there needs to be an understanding that gender is fluid, and from moving from this binary representation of gender to a more fluid representation, this really helps with overall kind of inclusivity and really fosters kind of curiosity and this healthy holistic development of young people in educational spaces. This also facilitates inclusive attitudes towards groups that are typically othered. So looking at gender can then help to explore issues of individuals who are from religious minorities or racial minorities in that school community, and really helps general discrimination in those educational institutions. Therefore, so kind of looking at, once we've applied those anti-oppressive kind of teaching and learning strategies, looking at curriculum and resources and support, this then leads to a shift away from the Cartesian mind-body dualism kind of diagram of the human being. So Descartes was a kind of philosopher, and he looked at mind-body dualism, where the mind and the body are two separate faculties that individuals possess. You can see this all over. You can see this in the curriculum. So for example, when we group science and maths, and then when we group the arts together, so like drama, music, we view maths and science as the mind subjects, and we view the arts as the body subjects. So you can see how this kind of theory can be applied to lots of different kind of areas of education. And by moving away from this to a more holistic practice, focusing more on individuals more widely, just as human beings, as multifaceted individuals with their own lived experiences, this really helps to have this positive step towards fostering more inclusive attitudes. And it kind of shifts away from this kind of binary pedagogy, this binary model of education, to a more fluid one. And hopefully by introducing kind of that more fluid, inclusive queer pedagogy in education alongside the policies, hopefully that will help to look at more inclusive practices. I know that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I apologise, there's quite a lot of information in there, but hopefully people found that interesting. Thank you guys so much for listening. Please pop your questions in the chat or turn your microphones on. I'd be more than happy to like have a little chat and kind of talk through some questions about it.
Thank you so much, Bea. I'm just going to press stop recording.